Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, China criticizes Japan's new defense white paper for hyping up the so-called China threat. China slams a statement from the Philippine Defense Department as vicious political provocation. Washington is reportedly drafting a ban on imports of new Chinese datacenter components. Brazil downgrades diplomatic ties with Argentina after Milei insults Lula. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. First up, China has expressed firm opposition to Japan's latest defense white paper, saying it is full of false narratives. China's Ministry of Defense says that the white paper's so-called security crisis and China threat are excuses for Japan's military expansion. A ministry spokesperson said Japan's neo-militarism has become a severe challenge to the post-war international order and a threat to regional peace and stability. The spokesperson emphasized that the Taiwan question is a red line that cannot be crossed, urging Japan not to go down the path of remilitarization. In the meantime, South Korea has also launched a strong diplomatic protest after Japan renewed its territorial claim to the Dakota Islets in the same defense white paper. The South Korean's foreign ministry has urged Tokyo to withdraw its claims, saying it is going to respond to any provocation by Japan over that territory. So for more on this, joining us now on the line is Professor Qu Qiang from Minzu University of China. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Qu Qiang.
Thank you.
Starting from the year 2023, Japan's annual defense white paper has been portraying China as the unprecedentedly biggest security challenge for Tokyo. Does Japan have a legitimate security concern here?
Well, I don't think they have any so-called security concern. Basically, they're trying to find an excuse for themselves to expand their military presence. I think is what Japan is doing right now is calling who is a thief. Well, just take a look at some fact. Who has really been, proliferation, their whole army and weapons. I think Japan has already been pushing the defense spending to more than 2% of their GDP. This is the highest level ever since the World War II. I think last time I remember, Japan still follows the peaceful constitution, right? But I think their current development is far, far, far more than just the demand of the peacekeeping. I think they're developing the long-range missiles, the gliding missiles, and the chemical weapons, and also they're planning to send their troops overseas to some places never regarding the Japanese security demand. And I think what behind that is they have a very strong demand to weaponize their economy and also economize their weapon industry. So they want to earn money, to be very easy and blunt. I think who is doing that? I think is the current leadership. I think the current leadership has been bonding with the chaebols in Japan. And also they want to make sure all those kind of manufacturing capabilities can actually be translated immediately to lethal power, lethal weapons. For example, in the Mitsubishi, everybody knows they are very good at engineering and heavy industries. But right now, I think with only a snap of fingers, they can switch the power of building ships, building the tractors into tanks, into nuclear submarines, and also aircraft carriers. And also, I think they're developing the space weapons. So I think one of the countries been defeated and who has been responsible for the major crime and the major tragedy during the Second World War actually has become a country trying to challenge the current post-World War orders. And I think they are making the whole region really in a nervous situation because when they're trying to gear up with all the weapons, I think the whole region actually will catching up in the competition, try to, scale up their defense. I don't mean only about Eastern Asia. And also, I think in ASEAN nations, Malaysia, Indonesia, and all these areas are feeling all this kind of the nervousness.
Yeah, okay. So We know this year's white paper basically tells us that Tokyo is seriously preparing for a so-called Taiwan contingency. For example, it is pointing to several deployments of Chinese aircraft carriers to the Pacific waters over the past year or so as evidence regarding Beijing intending to prevent outside intervention during a so-called Taiwan contingency. What do you think is erroneous about Tokyo's calculation here?
Well, I think there are three fundamental problems and mistakes that made by Japan. I think the misjudge about the nature of everything, and also they misunderstood their roles of international geopolitics. And also, I think they misunderstood the whole risk. Why the nature is wrong, and I think Taiwan, well, according to last time I checked, according to the United Nations, according to all the legal document, and even according to the legal document between China and Japan, between China and America, this is a pure Chinese domestic political issue. It's not a international question. So when China are trying to sort out the orders within its own range of territory, I think this is what they do, with what we call sovereignty, which Japan basically don't have it. So they probably should only imagine what sovereignty looks like. So they probably don't understand. So we can pardon them and we can, feel sorry for them. But here is the thing. When somebody have something in their own home, and as a neighbor, you should never jump in and say, okay, this is my problem. I have all the rights to jump in your family issue and also to use weapons to cut in with my interest. So this is purely wrong. And secondly is they misunderstood their own role. And by what and with what foundation they can interfere and stop China to do some, domestic questions, solve some domestic questions. While China and Japan actually have already achieved a peaceful correlations by our former leaders. And also Taiwan question is basically one of the cornerstone understood by our former leaders. I think that is a bottom line, and everybody has already been respecting that for a very long time. I think that's a reason why China and Japan had this peaceful relation and fast economic, growth and partnership in the past 50 years. And now Japan actually are treating it as their own issue. So I think this is, basically misjudgment. And also I think they misunderstand and underestimated the cost if they want to do the things and to jump in the Taiwan question and try to balance China. And I think they probably suffer a lot of the backfire they will never imagined. Well, they think the two nuclear bomb is the worst thing is going to, down put on them. Well, I'm going to say this is the least lethal result they're going to face if the things really go sour. So I don't think Japanese people want that. I still believe most of the Japanese people are peaceful. They don't want to see that. We can see from the protest, but only a few bunch of representatives and politicians and representatives from the defense complex in Japan, they want to push the things so far. So I think they probably will lead Japan into a very dangerous situation. And I think it's all of our duty and obligation, the country from the East and West, and also people from Japan should stand together to stop those maniacs.
The white paper of this year is also taking issue with the joint China-Russia military exercises in the Pacific Ocean, saying they constitute a concern to Japan. And as relevant content, it even points to the leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea standing together in Beijing last year to mark the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against the Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War. What do you think this tells us about the Japanese government's view on history?
I don't think they have any view on history. or if they have one, it's a wrong view. I think the victory of the anti-fascist war has been acknowledged by the whole world, not even, the victorious country, but also for the defeated country. Because, well, I have to say, in the defeated country, the one who really are suffering from this loss is their people, right? The Japanese people are also the victim of the whole war. They're not benefiting from it, and they're dying for it, for the imperialist, and they hate it as well as much as we do, including the Japanese people, including all these people in Germany and Italy. They acknowledge this victory. They know the war is right. They know it stopped the further tragedy. But very sadly, well, Germany has already understand what's going on. I think German people, German government are doing really well. Italy are doing very well. But I think there's only one country in the world, actually, they're never countering on this past and to try to reflect on their own mistakes. That is imperialist in Japan. Well, after the war, I think MacArthur, make a huge mistake. They kept the system of the Tenno, and also they cut the slack on those war criminals. And those war criminals and their offsprings are right now dominate current Japanese political arena. And they're trying to brainwash their people and try to revise their textbook and to teach their people that they have made no mistake and they're only, the victim of the nuclear bomb, and their enemy is China, is America, is Russia, even though they're trying to follow America. But hey, American people, you have to know, under that, they are also seeing you as enemies, right? So that's their view of the history. So I think not only us, but also Japanese people, hey, wake up. Your government is trying to, take yourself down to the muds and also the wall fires.
Then as for the islets disputes over the kudo between South Korea and Japan, do you think Seoul is justified to protest against the contents of the latest Japanese white paper? I mean, Japan nowadays is continuing to assert sovereignty over the islets in its policy papers, public statements, as well as school textbooks. What do you think this tells us about who is the real assertive power in the region?
Well, first of all, that Japan is not, a lot of people who understand about the Japan currently. Japan is never a country which is as large as it is today. Current Japan, classic Japan, only consists of just a few islands, like Honshu and Kyushu. And even the Shikoku and also the Hokkaido doesn't belong to Japan like 100 years ago. Well, they colonized the Hokkaido. It's like American used to colonize the reserve regions of the Native America. It's like they drive away the native Ainu people and colonize those places. And also they expanded to the Ryukyu. The Ryukyu is the current Okinawa. Ryukyu actually 100 years ago is an independent country, was the king with all the laws. And this is a great civilization with the same level of civilization, second to none. Well, it's similar to Japan, similar to China, similar to, the ancient Korea. But anyway, they just swallowed in with some brutal forces, and to say Ryukyu never exists and Okinawa ever since the ancient time belongs to Japan. So these are all wrong. And also about this island, we understand. Well, it always belongs to Korea. And during their colonial period of time, the Japanese Empire just colonized this island. And ever since that, they claim this island belonged to Japan. But we all know this island belongs to South Korea, same as, the Diaoyuidao belongs to China. And they call it the Senkaku, island. But no, it's not belong to Japan. It all happens within the time that the Japanese Empire, colonized the whole region. I think it's time to return the whole thing, to what it should be. And if Japan says, okay, the northern four islands belongs to themselves, not belongs to Russia, I think this is the same principle. If this four island doesn't belong to Japan, let me say that. Okay, Ryukyu or Okinawa doesn't belong to you, and Hokkaido doesn't belong to you as well. You should return them to the Ryukyu people, return them to the Hokkaido Ainu people to make them an independent country again. So you cannot have double standard. So that means the Japanese accusation against Korea is foul and denial. I think this is just an excuse for them, well, I understand what they've been saying. That is, they've been using this excuse ever since 2005, try to, amplify the power of the self-defense team in Japan. And also, they try to use this as excuse to, scale up the defense spending within the GDP and the government budget in Japan. So I think this is another excuse of the Wanping town. This is another excuse of the 18th September event in China. It's just an excuse before they launch another large invasion.
Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Qu Qiang joining us from Minzu University of China. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China has slammed a recent Philippine Defense Department statement as a malicious political provocation. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson on Tuesday said the so-called statement is full of disinformation and smears designed to interfere in China's internal affairs. The spokesperson said that a small handful of anti-China forces in the Philippines have engaged in massive political and public opinion manipulation in order to seek some selfish political gains and to cover up their own country's infringement activities at sea. He emphasized the implementation of the Ethnic Unity and Progress Promotion Law in China will serve as a solid legal safeguard for the country's ethnic unity and progress. Last week, a statement from the Philippine Defense Department took issue with China's ethnic policies, claiming that they are affecting ethnic minorities in the country. So for more, joining us now on the line is Ina Tengen, Senior Fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ding.
So first of all, it is very unusual for a Philippine government agency to point fingers at China's domestic affairs. What do you think could be going on here?
Well, I mean, the Philippines has become a proxy for Washington. And as the term for Marcos comes to its end, he's anxious to please the U.S. You have to remember the Marcos family had a tremendous amount of money, which has never been recovered by the Marcos family. The suspicion is, or they believe, that the U.S. government has frozen those accounts, and that might be an incentive. Anyways, at the end of the day, you had Marcos, who was very, very accommodating to the U.S., putting missiles in sensitive places that could be used against China. Provoking China, for instance, this latest incident while Wang Yi was on the sidelines of a big conference, having Philippine boats attack Chinese Coast Guard boats and filming it, just happening to have foreign correspondents on the boats, as has happened in many other cases. So the way people should look at it, from my point of view, is that this is just a provocation.
Yeah. The ASEAN, in which the Philippines is a full member, actually has a tradition of not pointing fingers at any country's internal affairs. Do you think this Philippine Defense Department statement is consistent with the ASEAN spirit?
No, of course not. I mean, Marcos is coming to the end of his term. His main concern is that the U.S. support whoever he wants as his successor. He's concerned about Duterte's daughter coming into power and doing to him what he has done to her father, and that is recommend that he be prosecuted for the crimes that he's committed. You have Duterte's own sister saying that he's a drug user. Don't know what else to say about it. This is not an enemy. This is his own sister. Saying that is acknowledging something that's out there. So right now he's very desperate. The only ally he has is the U.S. Interfering in Chinese internal affairs it doesn't mean anything to him because he's not going to be around. The elections will come. He will leave. His only concern is that he gets the U.S. backing for whoever he believes should replace him and protect him going forward.
By the way, Ina, What is your understanding of China's ethnic unity and progress promotion law that has been passed and taken effect so far this year?
Well, if from the Western point of view, anything that China does is wrong. I mean, if China figured out how to create world peace, the Western retort would be at what cost? So it's not surprising that they're taking a negative view towards something which is normalizing China's policy. People have to understand that China in 1949 was divided by language. You literally could not, so many different areas where people could not speak the language. So they had to create a simplified Chinese and unify the country so that people could move around. I mean, China was built by immigrants within China who came from different areas and worked very, very hard and diligently and did it. But they needed to have a common language. This was not applied to the 53 minorities that were a part of China, 54 if you count it another way. But in the end, they used the Soviet system, which said, okay, we leave those separately. That was probably a mistake in hindsight. Today, what China has done is passed a law that says we are going to treat China as one China. Every person in China needs to know Chinese. Why? Because if you don't know Chinese, you become a second-class citizen. And by Chinese, I mean standard Pudong law. It doesn't matter what your local dialect is. China is not trying to suppress that. What they're saying is that you have to have a common language. Otherwise, you will be relegated to working only in your area. So, and there's also this issue about, how do you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself as an ethnic, or do you identify yourself as a Chinese and then an ethnic? There's nothing wrong, and they're promoting, and still schools still teach in the ethnic local languages. At the end of the day, though, they're saying that there has to be a unifying factor, and I think that's basically common sense. It's the way that China has been able to grow so much. So this idea that somehow this is nefarious instigation to make people miserable is nonsense.
I mean, on the other hand, people who migrate to the United States legally need to learn English. They need to learn about the U.S. history, right?
Yeah. Well, hypocrisy is not an issue for many people, from in the U.S. Now, it's the U.S. is instigating other countries to make this an issue, while the U.S. is kicking out foreigners because they don't like foreigners, despite the fact it's a nation of foreigners.
Yeah.
The hypocrisy goes on. Discussing it won't change it. The fact is that, as I said to begin with, no matter what China does, it's wrong. If it could create world peace and prosperity, the U.S. would say at what cost?
Yeah. So apart from taking issue with China's ethnic policies, the same statement from the Philippines Defense Department also voiced the support for scrutinizing Chinese-linked education programs, for example, Chinese language programs in the Philippines. What could be the harm of voicing such a stance?
Well, obviously they're trying to stir up ethnic hatred. Within the Philippines, some of the wealthiest families are in fact Chinese. In fact, Marcos's family is ethnically part Chinese. But this is a political card. When you're trying to appeal to the masses, what you do is you try to at least appear that you're attacking those that they blame for not being prosperous. So, I mean, this is pure politics, and this is the way people have to understand this. It's nothing to do with ideology. This isn't about democracy or anything like this. It's not about trying to create a better world or taking care of people. This is simply the Defense Department of the Philippines using issues in order to attack China because they have not been able to, create the economic environment that is advantageous to Filipinos. Attacking China, you're one of your largest trade partners,
it's really a big gamble, to say the least. But thank you very much for joining us, Ina Tingen. Thank you very much. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hun in Beijing. We'll be back after a short break.
Welcome. I'm Ilaf Elad, economics professor and member of the Data Science and AI Center at New York University, Shanghai. On the World Today program, you can find in-depth and impartial insight, as well as critical commentary on key trends in the Chinese economy, financial technology, business, and blockchain. To prepare for the world tomorrow, join me on World Today.
You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hun in Beijing. China has announced a series of countermeasures in response to the latest U.S. move to draft a ban into imports of new Chinese data center components. Beijing's measures include tighter export controls on drones-related components, suspending certain product certification cooperation with U.S. agencies, launching a national security review into imported office printing and copying equipment, and placing 6 U.S. entities on the sanctions list. The U.S. Federal Communications Commission is reportedly preparing a new policy to bar imports of new Chinese optical transceivers. Beijing is urging Washington to reverse its measure and return to resolving differences through dialogue and cooperation. So for more on this, my colleague Xu Yawen earlier spoke with Andy Mauk, author of the book, The Innovation Machine, How China Creates and Adopts Technology Through Governance, and also a professor joining us from Beijing Foreign Studies University.
Andy, China has chosen this moment to roll out a new round of countermeasures against the United States. Why now? What message is Beijing hoping to send?
Well, I think it's important to note, Yawen, that Beijing actually did not choose this moment. It was actually decided by Washington. One of the foundational principles of diplomacy is reciprocity. So Beijing is responding now because this is a direct, prompt, and calibrated response to American action. And I think it's important to point out here that from the Chinese side that they've demonstrated a fair amount of restraint, but that this restraint is a choice and it is not incapacity or the inability to respond with perhaps more forceful measures. And that's something I think to bear in mind. And I think the way to really understand this is this, maybe we can call it Washington's approach to both talk and try to squeeze China won't be tolerated by the Chinese side.
China's Ministry of Commerce says the latest U.S. measures go against the consensus reached during previous trade talks. So from Beijing's perspective, which commitments has Washington failed to honor? And what does this mean for the current state of China-U.S. economic and trade ties?
I think that the main thing is this one-year truce and the leaders, both leaders, explicit agreement to quote-unquote avoid a vicious cycle of mutual retaliation and to resolve any differences by consultation. So I think from the Chinese side, it's seen as using these non-tariff tools is a violation of the agreement.
Instead of taking broad-based action, China has targeted 7 specific U.S. entities. What do these companies have in common, and why were they chosen for this latest round of countermeasures?
Well, Yawen, I think you're absolutely correct in that China has not responded in a broad-based way, but in a very targeted, even surgical way. And here, these 7 companies really are the means by which American sanctions are executed. So, everything from DNA tag, cotton, lab, isotropic testing, etc. And that this is, again, I think, showing that Beijing can reach private actors who act on American policy and not just parts of the American government.
Well, we have noticed that in previous trade disputes, China often responded with reciprocal tariffs. And this time, however, the Ministry of Commerce has stressed that it reserves the right to take all necessary measures. Does this signal a shift in Beijing's response strategy? And how has this approach evolved?
Well, I think it does and it doesn't. And again, one of the another key principle of diplomacy besides reciprocity is ambiguity, a deliberate ambiguity, because that gives both sides room to negotiate and coexist. So I think here that this is very deliberate. It again opens the door for Beijing to take stronger measures, but it is not, on the other hand, saying it absolutely will. And I think what this does is it preserves flexibility and then hopefully, allows Washington to perhaps rethink its recent actions.
Andy, you probably have noticed that alongside the export controls on 7 U.S. entities, China has also launched its first ever foreign trade national security investigation, focusing on imported printers, copiers, and other office equipment. Why is this significant? What could it mean for the future use of this policy tool?
Well, I think what this shows is again, China's commitment to its own long-term development goals and to not be sidetracked, but at the same time, to respond in kind and proportionately. So, this is really just China using the US approach and mirroring it or replicating it. So again, I would just come back to this idea that in international relations, reciprocity or tit for tat, if we wanted to use game theory to talk about this, is seen as the most effective strategy.
Andy, at the same time, the Ministry of Commerce says China will firmly safeguard its legitimate rights and interests while remaining open to dialogue based on mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit. How do you interpret this message? What does it tell us about Beijing's broader approach to managing economic ties with Washington?
Well, I don't think there's anything new here, Yawan. So, again, I think one thing, if we were to contrast the two countries, is that China is stable, predictable, and consistent in terms of its longer term goals and its actions towards other countries. And this really is just saying, look, we will not be bullied, but at the same time, we think it's important to have this relationship and we're open to dialogue. As long as it's based on mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefit. So, again, maybe not too much new here. And I think just again, signaling that from the Chinese side, this is a relationship that has to be managed and that they don't want it to be ruptured.
If the United States introduces further restrictions on Chinese products, what additional legal or policy tools could China use to respond? And what impact could that round of countermeasures have on global supply chains and the wider trading system?
Well, I think the obvious one, of course, is rare earth export controls. That this is something that I think the U.S. is quite aware of. But, I think there's other tools as well. I mean, we think about, Boeing airplanes, soybeans, are two also very politically important industries for the United States where China can have an impact. So, I think, again, there's, again, I think it's the Chinese approach is measured, calibrated, but also this does not mean that it does not have the ability to take stronger measures.
We know the two countries' leaders are probably going to meet in September. So how could this kind of trade conflicts between the two countries now affect that potential dialogue between the two countries' leaders?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Yawen. I mean, I think, again, I can't speak for the Chinese government, but, I can't imagine that, this creates a more conducive environment for strengthening the relationship. And, again, it always seems puzzling that, the U.S. does these actions that, don't seem to be in its own interest, either in the short term or in the longer term.
Andy Mauk, author of the book The Innovation Machine, speaking with my colleague Xu Wen. This is World Today. We'll be back.
OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic are all cutting prices. Coincidence? Or a sign that Chinese AI is changing the game? As Washington weighs tougher restrictions on Chinese AI models, Silicon Valley is sending a very different message, with NVIDIA, Microsoft, and others embracing open-weight AI. So can the U.S. still contain China's AI rise, or has the race already shifted from stopping China to competing with it? Join us as we unpack the next chapter in the global AI battle on this week's Chat Lounge. Listen wherever you get your podcasts and on CGTN Radio.
You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. The U.S. economy grew more slowly than expected in the second quarter, with GDP expanding at an annualized rate of 1.5%. Yet, beneath the headline, consumer spending remains resilient and a business investment, particularly in AI infrastructure and software, continue to surge. At the same time, persistent inflation, geopolitical tensions like the Iran war, and a divided Federal Reserve are clouding the outlook. For more, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics with Willamette University.
So, Yan, thank you very much for joining us. The U.S. GDP grew by 1.5% in the second quarter, below the market expectations. So how do you explain it? What are the main reasons for that?
Right. So this actual growth rate of 1.5% for the second quarter was below the market expectation of 1.8%. It is also lower than the 2.1% growth registered in the first quarter. So I think there are a couple of reasons for this slowdown. One has to do with, the inventory changes, which, the inventory has been drawn down by businesses, which then reduce their actual, fresh investment. Also, federal government spending has also gone down by 0.3%. So this subtract from the top line readings. On top of that, the import surge, largely driven, by this AI investment boom, that also reduced the growth momentum. But otherwise, I think the AI investment is still really what drives the growth. When you look at for example, the gross private domestic investment, that has gone up by 0.5%. Again, most of these domestic investments now are driven by the AI investment. And also consumer spending maintained quite strong, momentum, grew at 2.1%. But that said, we also saw that consumers now dipped into their savings to make their ends meet. The personal saving rate declined to 2.7%, which is the lowest in 4 years. So that casts some doubt about how much more consumer spending can continue to be strong to push up the GDP growth rate.
And as you mentioned, the investment in AI infrastructure and software continues to surge. So can the AI-led investment offset the weakness in other sectors like manufacturing, like the real estate? Or do you think the U.S. economy is becoming overly dependent on a handful of technology companies?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think if you look at the numbers provided by the Bureau of Economic Analysis and with some, brief calculations, I think AI now really account for over 68% of the private non-residential investment. So by the numbers, pretty much AI is driving close to more than half, over 52% of the real GDP growth rate in the second quarter. So I think that really begs the question about this over-concentration or over-reliance on the AI investments. So I think it does provide some kinds of offset for the capital investment weaknesses in manufacturing and real estate sector. But this kinds of concentration risk is not to be ignored, especially when this AI investment is highly dependent on just a handful of mega cap technological firms. So that could really amplify, market vulnerability if AI monetization stalls or slows down. So, and also we know that AI is going to help productivity growth, but that is going to over the longer term. So any disruptions in the AI monetization process, especially now with a lot of competition from China, I think that would then in some ways send the market to a tailspin when if there are doubts about all these AI investments, whether or not they will be continue to be worthwhile. Any slowdown in the kind of AI investments could then slow down the U.S. economy.
And the Federal Reserve kept the interest rates unchanged recently, but three policymakers voted for interest rate hike. So what does this unusual level of disagreement tell us about the economic outlook?
Well, I think that really shows these, these three dissenting votes for a rate hike review the institutional uncertainty and also the lack of consensus on what the so-called neutral interest rate is going to be at the FOMC. So I think these three votes, especially when you listen to the Dallas Fed chair, she basically expressed her concern that inflation is going to become more structurally embedded or a lot more stubborn in the economy, especially, even though the PCE reading has slowed down from 4.1% in May to now 3.7% in June. But still, when you look at the core PCE, it is still way above the 2% target of the Fed. So I think this is why the three members of FOMC think that it's time for a rate hike in order to bring the inflation down to the benchmark, to the target. But I think that the Fed is really trending a very difficult balance here because on the one hand, we're seeing inflation moderate down, but still facing a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, especially the war with Iran. I think the energy price is still very volatile. So the inflation rate is not necessarily trending down one way. On the other hand, the labor market is also slowed down quite significantly. So I think the Fed is really facing this dilemma. If they hike the rate, which could help to reduce inflation expectation, but then this will further derail the labor market. But if they don't hike the rate, then again, inflation is hard to be brought back to their target. So I think that also shows how the Fed is now would have to really watch very carefully how the data is going to play out in the coming weeks and months. And I think with this new Fed chair, Kevin Walsh, who has been quite silent when it comes to his communications to the rest of the world, that also adds more uncertainty to this kinds of policy watchers. Exactly how the Fed is going to do in the coming months.
And for the U.S. economy, analysts highlighted the Middle East conflict as a key downside risk. So how much of today's economic uncertainty is being driven by the geopolitics rather than the domestic economic fundamentals, do you think?
Well, I think the war with Iran is really making a lot of, again, I think it amplifies the kinds of uncertainty, especially when it comes to energy prices and inflation. So as I mentioned earlier, that the June reading of the inflation rate has gone down quite significantly. And that is largely due to, the ceasefire that was reached in June that really reduced the energy prices. For example, the gasoline price has gone down quite significantly by 8 or 9%. So that really helped to reduce the energy goods and services prices, which declined by 5.9% in June. That is what really helped to tame down inflation. But as we know, this ceasefire plan pretty much have gone out of the window. And so now Donald Trump is again on and off when it comes to the attack or the ceasefire with Iran. So I think that continued to pose great uncertainty and volatility to energy prices and therefore for inflation. And we know that the longer the inflation drags on, the more energy prices got filtered into other sectors of the economy, including transportation and other services, then the more inflation is going to stay and the more inflation expectation is going to be biased upwards. And so then it becomes a lot more difficult to tame down inflation. So I think that remains to be a key downside risk for the U.S. economy. On top of that, energy, sort of uncertainty, there's also, this AI boom and investment, which can also in some ways inflate the economy, because when you have a lot of the investments into the hard infrastructure in data center, for example, and yet, with all these supply chain disruptions and the lack of productive capacity within the United States, that also pose a lot of risks. What if, these AI investments cannot keep up? And what if that, fuels the inflation? So all of these could also, pose downside risk despite, the overall positive impacts so far that AI investment has on the economy.
Yan Liang, professor of economics, was Willamette University, talking with my colleague, Zhao Yang. You're listening to World Today. We'll be back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Brazil has downgraded diplomatic ties with Argentina after renewed attacks by Argentine President Javier Milei on his Brazilian counterpart Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. It is the first time in recent history that such a move has taken place between the two neighbors. Brazil's Foreign Office says Milei has called Lula a thief 3 times since Sunday. He used a similar wording on July the 25th at a party convention of Flavio Bolsonaro, the opposition candidate who will challenge Lula in October's presidential election. Milei also accused a Brazilian Supreme Court justice of being trashed, quote-unquote, during the same event. Argentina has expressed regret over the decision from Brazil. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Jiang Shixue, distinguished professor with the Center for Caribbean Studies, Hangzhou Normal University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good, thank you.
So first of all, from a diplomatic standpoint, what could be the immediate consequences of the decision on the part of the Brazilian government?
Well, you can imagine that without formal official diplomatic relationship, that will be a kind of there will be less room for a political dialogue to deal with this kind of conflict. I believe that for the time being, both sides will not back down. So we can expect that the two leaders or the foreign ministry from both sides will not sit down face to face to discuss how to go out of this kind of trouble. And probably this kind of difficult situation will continue to exist until the next election. And let's also suppose that if President Lula can win this kind of election in October, then this kind of political dilemma will continue to exist. So it's really a sad story.
So to what extent are this diplomatic clash between Argentina and Brazil driven by President Milei's ideological alignment with Brazil's right-wing opposition ahead of the Brazilian October election?
You know, on the political stage in Latin America, over the past several years, we have seen that there is a shift of the political pendulum from left to the right. That means the right-wing forces in Latin America is gaining more foot, and so the left, represented by President Lula, is on the defense, and also supported by U.S. President Trump. So the right wing is quite happy to see that probably they want to deal a heavy blow to the left-wing force in America. And this kind of political frontation will continue to go on forward. So this is really, again, a sad fact.
Actually, on another front, the U.S. State Department has just revoked the visa for Brazil's ambassador to Washington in retaliation for denied visas to U.S. President Donald Trump's nominee for the U.S. ambassador to Brazil. So how do you assess the risks of this, let's say, localized South American Brazil-Argentina dispute morphing into a broader, more volatile geopolitical standoff involving the United States?
Well, you are right. On the so-called diplomatic front, I would say that Brazil is really in a difficult situation. So President Lula is under attack from the so-called right-wing forces from its south as well as from its north. So in a certain sense, Trump and Milei are getting more united to send a kind of a very big power, or in a sense, the so-called political interference in Brazil's domestic affairs. So I hope that Brazil's presidential election in the coming months will not be heavily affected by this kind of attack from the south and from the north.
So exactly talking more about that, Professor Jiang, we know recently on Sunday, I guess, local time, Brazil's Vice President Geraldo Alckmin made a half-jokingly said that Brazil's electronic voting system is so effective that, quote, it does not accept any votes from Argentines and Americans, unquote. How valid are President Lula da Silva's Workers' Party's fear regarding foreign interference, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I want to say that this joke is very good. Well, I would point out that President Lula's fears are quite valid. As you know, when the presidential is coming to the stage, so any party, any candidate is quite concerned about some kind of rumors, fake news, all kinds of things. So I think for the time being, I can guess that President Lula is quite concerned about the possibility that the right-wing forces from Argentina and the U.S. will get more united with the right-wing forces within Brazil to make fake news, make rumors, so that President Lula will suffer in a sense.
Yeah. So lastly and briefly, Professor, how might this intense international pressure, let's say, impact the behavior of Brazilian voters in this country's upcoming election?
Well, it's really hard to say. Just yesterday, I talked to a person who has spent quite a few months in Brazil, and he said that it's really hard to guess who will win. It simply depends on whether or not there will be some kind of fake news, rumors, corruption scandals coming out of the political stage. And that kind of thing might be related to the so-called external influence from Argentina or Brazil. So let's see what will happen.
Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Jiang Shixue, distinguished professor from the Center for Caribbean Studies, Hangzhou Normal University. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.